Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this episode of our regular series, Basic Notions of Metaphysics, we'll talk about notion of metaphysical analogy, also known as analogy of being, or in Latin, Analogia Entis. The term comes from the High Middle Ages philosophy that was understood as scientia transcendens, transcendental philosophy, in a very specific sense. Of course, analogy, both as metaphysical notion and as a notion that is applied in other sciences and everyday life, is older than Middle Ages. But this particular understanding of analogy that I want to focus on here is something that was developed to perfection in the Middle Ages and High Middle Ages, that is, to be more precise, by Thomas Aquinas, and to some extent, of course, his predecessors and contemporaries, because the notion of individual authorship in traditional metaphysics is something that is quite different from what we understand by it today. But I think this will become obvious in the course of this podcast. Now, to explain what analogy, or that is metaphysical analogy, is, I think it's best to start with our everyday notion of analogy, which does not correspond to metaphysical analogy, but it's a good start so we can discern some everyday prejudices we have about it, which, albeit not correct, contain a lot of truth, as is always the case with the common notions of people. So analogy is commonly being understood as a relationship of terms, and to be more precise, a proportional relationship, where first term relates to second, in the same way the third term relates to fourth. Four terms, that is to say, two pair of terms, and vice versa. In this sense, analogy is more like a way of speaking where the stress and focus is on relation of words, meanings, and so on, and not so much on the words, on beings that are addressed by the words themselves. This is most certainly not analogy that we will talk about now, although it is in a way a derivative form of it. Analogy, as was used and developed in the Middle Ages as a method of metaphysics or scientia transcendens, but also as understood as a principle of reality, which it in fact is, comes from the long tradition of antiquity, and in its most comprehensive form, the inspiration for its development was Aristotle. Now, it's very important to understand that Aristotle's notion of analogy proper, that is, when he used the actual word analogy, is not really what I have in mind now. What was taken from him as an inspiration and further developed was something that he called proshen legomena. Proshen legomena means things said in accordance to one. Although maybe if we were to interpret it right away, a more proper way to say it would be things said in accordance to the first instance. Now, what this means? Well, Aristotle used one example that was also later taken over and repeated ad nauseam in Middle Ages, the example of the relationship of health and in itself and various instances of health in different contexts, let's say. So, for instance, when I say that some medical procedure is healthy, and then I say that someone's urine is healthy, I'm repeating the common example, or that this or that nourishment brings forth health, or that somebody has healthy looks about him or herself, I am always using these qualifications of healthy on the basis of one instance that possesses health to a greatest degree, that is to say, health itself. This is in a nutshell what Aristotle understands by it, and he used it, applied it in first philosophy, that is what was later pre-formulated in the term metaphysics. So why he did that? Because in Aristotle's understanding, and I would say in traditional understanding in general, the being, taken without qualifications, is an object of the first philosophical science, or that is to say, the highest science that human beings can have, that is to say, first philosophy or metaphysics. Being is therefore one, it is universal, it is present in all instances of being in a very specific sense. But being present in others, other beings, being, as they say, and we will explain this further, all beings participate, individual beings participate in being, we are faced with a situation that, on the one hand, in fact, at the same time, simultaneously, we understand being as one and as many. And how to approach this? There are three approaches, as Aristotle discerns them, that we can take. Or better to say, maybe, that are given to us to understanding. The first approach would be what is called equivocation or equivocity. In equivocity, a relationship of terms, of predicates, is such that the same predicates spoken or predicated to different beings don't have same definition. For instance, excuse me, to say that animal is lively, or to say that a picture is lively, painted lively, is equivocally spoken, because liveliness of colors and liveliness of the living being are obviously not the same thing. One can infer from this, for instance, that there is a proportionality here of words, because the very notion of liveliness which we apply to aesthetical experience comes in fact from nature. But this is not what Aristotle does, and this is it's very important. Why? The reason is because both Aristotle and both the medievals, even to a larger extent, always began philosophy or any kind of inquiry by inquiring about beings, about real actual beings, not about words. Whereas in our day and age, philosophy became a kind of explanation, or even, I would venture to say, story about language, where words are used to explain other words, and then other words and other words. That is to say, the object of philosophy is only what is spoken. How this spoken relates to things is secondary. In some forms of modern contemporary philosophy, there is no relation even, and so on and so forth. It is, to wit, philosophy of language. And it projects this image of philosophy in the past, considering that all philosophy was always just dealing with words. In a way that somehow we today realized that 2000 years of difficult problems were not real problems, but language problems or language games, for instance, as Wittgenstein would put it, and so on. This is very important to bear in mind. The reason why it is important to bear in mind is because precisely in a metaphysical analogy, the most important thing is order. That is to say, hierarchy. There is no hierarchy if you consider that all your inquiries are only about words. Then your inquiry is about things that stand in a horizontal relationship, where there is no higher or lower. Analogy serves precisely the purpose to explicate the lower into that which is higher. Now, the other way of addressing the multiplicity of the ways of being in one is so-called univocity, where being is spoken of in the same way, in the same mode, and in the same definition in two various instances. Example of univocity would be Hrvoje is a man, and for instance John is a man. In both cases, predication is spoken according to same logos, according to same nature, because both of those guys participate in human nature. So being is in this sense the same in both of them. So univocity is also a way of horizontal predication. Now we have to just a bit of digression into what predication means. Let us not think about predication initially in terms of words, because in traditional metaphysics, words are last. Words are just a tool to express what exists in reality. In reality, first exists a logos that is a kind of expression of some being itself. Predication in this sense would be a partial identity or partial identity of being, partial unity of being. When I say, for instance, Hrvoje is a man, I am saying that he participates in the nature of man, of human being, but it is also some other things, although nature, natural humanness is something that is completely, so to say, inhering in him, but identity is never so complete as if we had, for instance, the notion of humanity, of human nature, that we could kind of like deduce this individual man from it. It's impossible to do, because identity of finite being is never complete. It's never the same as the nature which this finite being is kind of like expressing, what Thomas Aquinas would call having an act of being, really acting out its own nature. This is predication. So predication is an ontological expression. It's expression of being. Analogia is a third way, or analogy is a third way to speak of this unity and simultaneous diversity of being. This is what Aristotle called proshen legomena. In analogy, we won't use Aristotle's terms anymore. Now we are switching to analogy, as Thomas Aquinas would use it. Analogy is the expression of predication of being that is different in all its instances, various instances, but has something essentially in common. Analogous expression would be following. I am man, Michael is an angel. We are beings, both of us, in an analogical way. Now what this means, and taking angel as an example, is by no means an accident, because angelology was an essential part of medieval scientia transcendens. It is quite incomprehensible. For instance, Thomas Aquinas is inapproachable as philosophers without his understanding of angels. Take it as you like it, but this is the fact. Angel is a being that has completely different nature than I. Because I, as a human being, necessarily possess matter, or am an expression of form in matter. Matter that is formed by a certain energy or act that makes it coherent and gives it a certain, let's call it logos or ratio. Angel, on the other hand, is a being that has no matter, that does not need matter to exist. The unity between me and angel, as instances of universal being, is such that we are, in a sense, completely different, and in a sense, we participate in something third, something that is making us one to a certain extent. And what would that be? This is what analogy tries to depict. That is to say, this is what analogy, to speak more properly for medievals, expresses, because it is always, all of these notions are for people who develop them, were expressions of reality, not words that try to interpret reality. This is very important to bear in mind. You don't have to believe this is true or justified, but you have to have it in mind when you think about those things. Now, it's obvious that Angel and I, Michael and I, are not equivocally beings, because there is a certain commonness. For instance, we both possess intellectual nature to some extent. We are not, however, and this is very important, univocally spoken as being, because, and this is very important to understand, univocality presupposes that two terms that are put, two instances of being that are put together as having something in common, presupposes that they have in common genera in common. Now, genera is my genera is animal, my species is intellectual being, or a being endowed with intellect, because there is something we call differentia specifica. Differentia specifica is an act of form, which you might understand as intelligible energy or intelligible act, that contracts the genera, for instance, which is wider than it. You have genera of animals, and intellectuality contracts a certain animal into completely unique being, which is man. And this would presuppose, in a case of angel, that there is also a genera of angel that he has common with me. But there is no such thing, because angels are completely different. The genera that brings forth animality does not exist in angel. They don't need it. They were created, let's say, in a completely different way. Now, this is very, very important to understand. So we are talking not about quantitative or qualitative difference. We are talking about essential differences. Differences that are so wide that if there weren't something that holds them together, those disparate beings, we would have a world where everything is separated from everything else. This is very important to bear in mind. So what is that is in common between the two? The common third, let's call it term, that connects these two instances, these two beings that are so different, is being itself. They both are. I just pointed out that this notion or this principle or being is not univocal. This means that the being is not genera, that in this particular instance, the angel and the man are not cut of the same cloth, so to speak. Somewhat literary, because genera is what you are made of, in fact. So what this being is then? Well, being, in traditional metaphysics, is contracted in categories. Categories are ways in which being is. Each being, when I say universal being, when I use this being without qualifications, I mean universally, how beings are. So they are substances, the answers to the question what is, for instance quantity, which is divided further into unit and extension and so on. It's very important to bear in mind that originally in Aristotle categories are not so formalized. They are answers to the questions. For instance, substance is TST, answer to the question TST in Greek. What is it? And this is the first category because there is a hierarchy in categories. Being is in itself is not one of the categories, because every category is a category of being. Categories are the highest genera of everything. Everything is spoken of and exists, therefore, in them, in some kind of way. Everything has some kind of, either has some kind of quality, quantity. For instance, angels don't have quantity, at least not quantity in the sense material things have, things that have bodies, because body in material thing is the principle of individuation, which makes it one discrete, countable body. Something completely different with, for instance, these spiritual beings or intellectual substances, as medievals call them. Being is not part of any of category, but it is present in all categories. They are its constructions. Therefore, being is not a genera. And the best way to understand this is that every genera needs this specific difference to individuate it into species or form. Because, for instance, as we talked about man is the animal which is specified into intellectual animal by the act of intellectuality, the form of intellect. And this makes man unique being. But what is important to understand is there is no intellect in animality. Intellectuality comes outside. The species comes, that is to say, difference comes outside of the genera. It acts upon genera. But being, there is nothing outside being. Only thing that is other than being, which means outside more or less, is non-being, that is nothingness, and nothingness does not compute here. So being is not genera, it transcends genera, and what is extremely important to understand, it is also not a concept. because every concept has to have this genus proximum and differentia specifica. That is to say, concepts are based on genera and species as a form of knowledge. Being is not a concept, and this is something that is very hard to figure out in this classical philosophy, not only Middle Ages, because we are not accustomed to think in this way now. And some interprets that are with long standing of academic interprets of Thomas Aquinas, for instance, can write whole life about him without figuring this out, that they are dealing the highest principles cannot be conceptualized, and that Thomas Aquinas' philosophy is therefore never a system. It is impossible for it to be a system of knowledge, yet they call it system nevertheless, without problems. But that's the story in itself. Now, being is intrinsic to both terms. Now, I was talking about angels and men. Let us give Thomas Aquinas' a famous example of two categories, how categories stand as the primary ways of differentiations of being, how they stand in the relationship. Substance and accident. Now, accident, you have to understand, is not simply accident like car accident. Accident is what is outside of the substance, what comes to substance as a kind of determination from the outside. For instance, if I am a substance, I am, trust me, branco. The fact that I am white is an accident, because the essence of me, the nature of me is that I'm a man, but the whiteness is not part of this essence. It is something that comes outside of the essence. So how the accident and substance tie together? Because they are both being. Only with one very important difference. Substance is more being than accident. Because accident is predicated of substance and not vice versa, obviously. This means that both substance and accident participate on the third principle, and this third principle is being. Ens universalis. And how this comes to pass? Well, we have to understand what participation is. Participation is act of something taking part into something else which is possessed by other being, essentially. So, to put it in a more comprehensible way, participation is having a part of something that something else has as a whole, as its essence. So, for example, I participate in the light of the sun, being shone upon by sun, which sun possesses, let's say, in an essential way, because it emanates from it. It is an act of the substance of the sun. It is the energy and operation of the sun. Sun has it in a full way, I have it in a partial way. To participate is to express the partial being. Both substance and accident participate on being, but substance participate in a more perfect manner, because substance is first category. You first have to have the answer on what is or who is something, and then the other categories. That is to say, it has more being than accident, but not in the quantitative sense, but in the participatory sense. So this is, in a nutshell, Analogia Entis. And there are some very important things about it we have to say now. It is an intrinsic relationship. This is the first thing. Participation is something that is participated by both terms of analogy in the intrinsic sense. This means that not only relations are analogous, but the very essences and essences in act are analogous. Remember Aristotle's example of health. So, procedure is healthy, visage is healthy, cure is healthy, urine is healthy, all in accordance as they participate in health. They are parts, let's say, parts of health. What health has in essence, healthy things have participation. And this is intrinsic relation. Why? Because health is the cause of healthy things. In Thomas's perspective, all things participate in being in analogous way, that is to say, comparable way, because they are caused by the same cause. They originate from the same source, and this source is God. Being that is participated in by all beings, separate beings, is the fact of creation. This is this ens universalis, and we'll go a little further into that a bit later. So the analogy is a causal relation, but it's very important that cause and origin, the father of analogy, is not part of analogy. God does not enter the analogy. What enters the analogy, as I said, is being and participation in being. Being, on the other hand, is a transcendental. It is a very specific way of existence, and we will come to that now. But first, I have to just to note that this understanding of analogy is not very prevalent among so-called neo-Thomists or even Thomists, some so-called Thomists of Middle Ages and Renaissance, because for some reason they missed, I don't know how this happened, this fact that this is the inner causal relation, and they talk about analogy as proportion merely. And this is not, this is factually not present in Thomas. So this is, I just want to mention this because I'm sure the people that listen to me or read my texts and essays follow these things on internet. And internet, there is a plethora of these people that call themselves Thomists or talk about Thomas Aquinas and take the stance which is completely out of touch with what actual doctrine was. And I'm not saying this only because I think that, but this is even consensus of some eminent scholars on Thomas Aquinas. But that's a story in itself. Now, we said that analogy is not a relationship of concepts. It's a real relationship. Also, we said it is the inner relationship, and it is based on the participation of being. We also said that being is not genera, being is not species. What is being in the sense of ens? Being is transcendental. Transcendental is the mode in which all beings are. Every being is most general thing, most general characteristic of everything that is. And most general characteristic of everything that is that it is. But there are others. Also, the most general characteristics of all beings is that being is good, because everything that is strives to conserve its being to be. This is the old teaching of goodness of being. That is something we have already in antiquity, in Plato and Aristotle, and we have it, of course, in Christianity. So being and good have the same extension, and they are therefore, by their extension and their reality, convertible, but they are different in the sense that they are different modes of existence. And this term mode is very, very important. Mode is something that differentiates some being in itself, intrinsically. That is to say, nothing outside has to apply. Now notice that this is impossible when we have genera and species relationship, because there has to be outside act. differentiation of being and good is such that it is inner differentiation. Let's say that good is explication of being. When you dwell upon being, you start to realize, let's say, if you want to look at it in terms of investigation and thinking about things, you kind of like resolve being into good and then into truth. That is also transcendental. I already spoke about it before in some other podcasts. I won't dwell now too much upon it. What is important to understand is that being is not being general and species is transcendental. Transcendentals are absolutely impossible to understand as concepts, although in later philosophy this is precisely what came to pass, inversion. We can have concepts of transcendentals. If I just said that being is what is, universal being, the fact that everything that is, and the good is, for instance, that towards which everything strives. I gave some definitions, haven't I? But these definitions are not really kind of exhaustive expressions of what transcendentals are. That's why they are very hard to understand, because you really cannot understand them conceptually. The concept only gives you a definition in an abstract sense, but there is in metaphysics, in scientia transcendens, in transcendental philosophy of Middle Ages, the method is not abstraction but what they call separation, where you separate these things that are not material, that transcend matter, but also transcend some conditions that every separate being must fulfill, like genera and species. What you do is more like coming in touch with them. They are not something that can be pinpointed, because they are too universal. And every concept kind of like pinpoints something general, but not absolutely general. In a nutshell, transcendentals are to be understood, I would even say rather symbolically, they are horizon, or they are light. And Thomas Aquinas uses this term not as a metaphor, for instance, for being. Transcendental of being, which is in his mind first. Being is equivalent to light, because in all things are comprehensible insofar as they are beings. Being is what makes them comprehensible and intelligible and transparent. And this is to be understood literally. This transparency is very hard, sometimes very hard to comprehend from contemporary point of view. And analogy is based on this. So analogy would be causal relationship, or rather to say proportional relationship based on causality, based on origin and remaining of the effect in the cause. Because nothing leaves the first origin, the first cause, it is always present. The signature of his presence is being itself. The things are that they are good, that they are true in terms of transcendentals. There are other transcendentals also, but we won't go into that now. So what we comprehend in analogy is not God as he is in himself, but God as a creator, as a giver of being. Because all analogous terms resolve into him, into his acts. Analogy is what gives us a form of theophany in a created world. We see, one could say, God's signature in it through analogy. And a very real signature at that, because not one of God's acts of creation is something that should be understood as static, as it happened and it doesn't happen before, because he keeps it in the existence. And therefore, the first and most universal fact of existence is being itself. And therefore, the participation on being is what unites all things. Analogy is a bond of the world. And to conclude this sometimes rather abstract exposition, I would recommend reading Tolkien, if you haven't read him before. I rarely speak of him. But in this context, I think it's appropriate. Because when you read his books, especially Lord of the Rings, he was, as you know, probably a very traditional Catholic. There is not one instance when God is mentioned in that book. Yet when you read it, you are aware that God is present in every sentence. This is the best metaphor I can conjure up to give you a sense of what Analogia Entis is. But let's say that this would be enough for this episode. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Trivium signing out.